Certainly, it's not so serious as modern philosophers made it out to be a few centuries ago when they introduced the problems of subjectivity and solipsism. In the 20th century, the emphasis shifted from the isolated individual to the disconnected group, and the problems of intersubjectivity and the social construction of reality. Well, we may indeed be stuck in a room with no exit and with that 6-ton elephant to boot, but we can crack open a window. Our social constructions are structurally coupled to the outside world, at least if we let them be. But social construction is a very important idea because we do construct our views of the world, albeit not out of whole cloth, but we construct them as a group, not individually. We tend to look at consciousness from the inside out as an individual, internal, intentional phenomenon. But you look at the word consciousness, and it implies that it's a property of the group, not the individual. It implies that it's a social phenomenon. The con in consciousness tells us that it's about something we share, shared knowledge, shared awareness. What accounts for this commonality? Certainly there must be an underlying basis in the coding of our DNA, which then manifests itself in our bodies and nervous systems. But biology alone does not account for development of consciousness as a group phenomenon. Rather, it's through interaction with others, through communication, that we are bound together in a community of consciousnesses. The formation and development of the individual consciousness is triggered and shaped by relationships with parents and other significant persons in our environment. I'd go so far as to say that communication is what enables human consciousness to form in the first place. To return to the metaphor of fire, consciousness is not a matter of spontaneous combustion. It's a spark traveling from one mind to another, a torch passed from one generation to another. Or to use a more recently coined term, it's a meme, replicating itself in one brain after another. A basic point in systems theory is that systems are nested and in a sense self-reflexive. Systems can exist within larger systems and those systems within systems that are larger still. It follows that the individual consciousness, which can be understood as a system or ecology of mind, can also be seen as part of a larger, as an interdependent part of a larger system, a group or collective consciousness, if you will. This is not necessarily a spiritual concept. It could be, but it's not necessarily one, as collective consciousness corresponds to some extent with the concept of culture. But this theory of metamind, the idea that we are part of a larger whole, is difficult to accept because we remain locked within the system, unable to get out. And especially difficult to accept for us in Western culture because of the emphasis we place on individualism, which leads us to think of ourselves as alone and unique in the world. But on the biological level, we all share the same basic genetic code, and on the social level, we all share, members of the same culture at least, use the same linguistic and symbolic codes. We think with forms of communication that are community property. We think with tools that are not of our own devising. And as much as we would like to think otherwise, our thoughts are not ours alone. Others have thought them. Others continue to think them. Central to my understanding of consciousness is the counterintuitive idea that consciousness begins with communication. This means that consciousness begins externally with interaction and then becomes internalized over time. The process of the exterior becoming interiorized has been discussed by scholars such as George Herbert Mead and Walter Ahn. Of course, the process of internalization is largely an unconscious one. We're not aware, we can't recall the formation of our own conscious minds. But an example of internalization that you ought to remember occurs when we learn to read. Reading begins as an external process, as we sound out letters to produce syllables, words, and sentences. After we learn to read out loud, we're then taught how to read silently. That's an internalization of an external process of reading. This is not an automatic development, and some children have great difficulty in mastering that, making the transition. It's also not automatic historically. Silent reading was a rare and unusual practice in antiquity and the Middle Ages. The internalization of reading and writing, I'd suggest to you, parallels the interiorization of language that occurs much earlier in our development. The fundamental form of language is sound, and from the beginning we listen to the speech of others in our environment and then make sounds of our own. Typically, this leads to speech acquisition. We learn language by speaking out loud and listening to others do the same, and only later do we internalize those voices as memory and other forms of thought. Talking to oneself then reflects a temporary or maybe a chronic lack of interiorization. On the other hand, auditory hallucinations may represent a misrecognition of the interiorization of language. And in this respect, Julian Jaynes offers some fascinating speculations about the origins of consciousness. That is, the early interiorization of speech. He suggests that the first stirrings of full consciousness were mistakenly interpreted as voices from the outside world, communication from supernatural beings. When people never thought before internally and they first had thoughts, they didn't know what to make of it. They said, "Who's talking to me?" And they concluded it must be a god or a spirit that was speaking to them. So the same process of interiorization works on all levels of symbolic activity. Even perception is interiorized as imagination, as visualization by the mind's eye, and as mental maps, phantom pains from lost limbs, hallucinations, memories, and dreams. Especially significant is the fact that our relationships with others are interiorized as well. Eric Berne, founder of transactional analysis, argued that we all have an internalized parent as part of our own psyche, scolding our inner child. Alternately, George Herbert Mead said that we internalize not only specific others, such as our parents, but a generalized other, through which we can try to see ourselves as others see us. In this way, we gain a measure of self-reflexiveness, self-awareness, self-consciousness. We also internalize others when we imitate them and learn how to play roles. From the perspective of Mead, Hugh Duncan, and Irving Goffman, the internalization of role-playing is the way that we form a sense of self, or rather selves, for they see us as the sum of the roles that we play, the selves that we put on. So from this point of view, consciousness is an act. It's an act that we perform in the theater of the mind. Put another way, individual consciousness is an interiorization of collective consciousness, an internalization of our relationships with others, with other pre-existing consciousnesses. The internalization of the external is the process by which human consciousness is formed and by which it changes. What McLuhan called the extensions of man in media and technology ultimately become the intentions of man. We can also say that consciousness changes because it's dynamic, it's an ecology of mind, it has to adapt to changes in its environment. And for the individual consciousness, there's a process of growth and development, a process that may continue over the entire course of our lives. Paralleling the change that occurs on the individual level, we can also say that collective consciousness changes, that human consciousness evolves, the point that Walter Ong, Julian Jaynes, and many others maintain. And for our purposes, it's sufficient to note that it is through a process of interiorization that human consciousness evolves. And if consciousness changes and evolves, we can say that it has a past and a future. Some of you probably thought that I was never going to get to the point of my talk, topic that Alan assigned me. Others probably just forgot what the topic was in the first place. All I can say is that it's in the nature of consciousness to wander. But the meandering path that I've taken has, I hope, led us into important new territory and brought us to the point where we can consider the road ahead. The media ecology perspective has at times been associated with futurism, but we have to begin by acknowledging that we're blind to the future, that all that we can really know is the past and maybe the present. That's what McLuhan called the rearview mirror effect. So once more, I seek the kindness and forgiveness of strangers and friends alike. For what I'm about to do is an indulge in some speculation and extrapolation in the performance of a task that's hopeless but not serious.